Welcome to episode 6 of At Your Doorstep, the show that covers everything gig economy, last mile delivery, and new technology. I'm your host, Kaylee Nix, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring a little bit about urban development that makes delivery safer, more equitable, and easier for companies. Here on At Your Doorstep, we've done a lot of discussion about how cities need to be changing in the future in order to work with new methods of delivery. But what about methods of delivery that already exist and changing themselves to accommodate what's happening right now? Today we're talking to Stephen Smith, CEO of Cord, and they're taking a unique approach to altering the physical landscape of cities. Stephen, thank you so much for being on At Your Doorstep today.
Thanks, Kaylee. Glad to be here.
So first things first, tell us a little bit about yourself and then what you do at Cord.
Sure. So I'm co-founder and CEO of Cord, and I'm an engineer by training. So actually, my first love was cars. Worked at BMW in designing of cars, and but quickly got the internet bug and have worked in a variety of industries since then, including marketplace businesses where essentially you're matching supply and demand. And essentially at Cord, we're bringing together these various strands in the sense that we see the founding idea of the company was really that there's a fixed supply of space in cities, particularly city streets, and an exploding demand for that space. And so as both in terms of volumes, just more vehicles every year, but also a scope of demand. So different vehicles of different shapes and sizes, semi-trucks in the same space as scooters, different operating models, vehicles pulling in and out very quickly, ride hail, et cetera, car share spots along the street. And then, of course, technological change. And so just bringing together, we see this sort of supply-demand mismatch, bringing together technology, bring that to bear, but also pricing as a way to dynamically allocate space to its best use. Is another kind of core founding idea. And so that's basically what we do at Cord. We call it the commerce platform for streets, enabling the owners and operators of the space, which is basically city government, and the users of the space, which is a mixture of individuals and businesses, i.e. fleets, to use that space in the most effective and beneficial way possible.
And so everyone I've talked to so far, we've talked a lot about the actual motion on city streets, whether that's navigating around cyclists and pedestrians or getting autonomous vehicles to drive safely on busy city streets, what have you with that. But curbs have never really come up in this conversation. And you've got to think about it because there really is kind of a monopoly on there. If you're driving a 53-foot reefer trailer downtown Chattanooga, you're going to have to find a space to park. And sometimes that's not so easy. So tell me why curbs are so important to this last mile delivery facet.
Sure. So I guess first and foremost, it's not only not easy, but it's actually about 28% of the trip time is actually spent by drivers of that truck, of fleets in general, delivery fleets, to find that space, right? So about 28% of that trip time is spent finding a space, circling, looking for it. If they can't find it, they have to double park, they get ticketed. So just a lot of friction, for want of a better term, for fleet drivers to go about their business every day. So that's a tremendous amount of waste of time, of course, and then associated with that, gas, the second largest cost for fleets, largest single operating expense, typically at 60% or so. And so that circling time, that idling time is obviously burnt fuel, obviously carbon emissions as well. And then, of course, the ticket costs. Like a UPS pays about $25 million a year to New York City alone. It's public record. So a phenomenal amounts of money that are built in essentially into the cost of the delivery. So a direct cost to the consumer or the business receiving that package or sending it more accurately. But then there's all the knock-on costs, right? The safety conditions for cyclists, pedestrians, other drivers, et cetera, who have to go around these vehicles into oncoming traffic sometimes. Obviously, the carbon emissions costs, the economic development costs in the sense that those businesses get delayed deliveries and things like that. So there's just it's a tax essentially on our friction on the entire economy of a city. So it starts with that little thing called the double parked truck, right? And the frustration of the driver finding that space and all the direct costs for that fleet. and then all the indirect costs for the city in terms of missed economic opportunity, safety, etc.
And so the whole idea behind Cord is to designate curb management so that people pull up to these places for delivery. Say I'm Coca-Cola dropping off at the Dollar General across the street, right? I've got a designated place to park. I've got designated time to be there, and that's managed specifically for me so no one else is in that. So talk to me a little bit about how you guys came to this idea and thought, you know what would be great is if we decided to dedicate spaces for people to use efficiently.
Yeah. So every large city in the world pretty much has thousands of curb miles of space, or curb lanes, technically, of space. It's broadly already regulated. The cities already have the ability to control it, to charge money for its use, to manage it more effectively. Historically, it's been done in a very analog way. And so, where we started with Cord was not to try to solve all problems at all times, but really to focus on the curb problem, and specifically within that, the loading problem. Because if you look at kind of all research, the delivery fleets today account for they're few in number relative to all the vehicles in a city, but they obviously are doing their deliveries all day long. And so those double parked delivery vehicles add up in terms of impact on congestion. And so it's one of the single greatest causes of congestion in a city, which we all dislike, getting stuck in traffic, is actually caused by those double parked delivery vehicles. And you might ask, well, why do they double park? Well, because there's no space for them in the curb lane that is plentiful enough, that is close enough to their destination, that is predictable. Like they know if they go to that space, they can get that space, and essentially have a better curb service, if that's kind of how we think about it. And so our solution to that is a thing we call Smart Zones. It's a program that we offer cities. So we partner with cities to implement Smart Zones. And it gives fleets and drivers the ability, before they commit to a particular block face, curb space, the ability in advance to essentially reserve the space at a particular time. They don't need to predict how much time they need. You pay as you go. And so they can route to that space that's reserved for them, start the meter, pay a reasonable fee for use of the space. People are used to paying parking fees. And then when they're finished, they literally just stop the clock, stop the meter, pull away. We also can automatically shut it off if they forget to do that. And so it's essentially predictability for that fleet. They know that, they know their destination, presumably, of where they need to make that delivery to the Dollar General store. And they might think that the best place to go is the block face, the curb right in front of that store. But actually around the corner, there's a reservable space that is very predictable, and you actually are best served by going there. And parking your vehicle there and making your delivery from that space. And so it's really kind of creating a better curb service is how we think about it for drivers, and in turn fleets that are operating at scale in cities, and changing this perception of the space as kind of one of kind of friction and tickets and things like that, into one of actually there's a better service here, and instead of paying fines and tickets and all of that, we can actually pay a reasonable fee to have a better curb service, cut that 28% down significantly, reduce the double parking so you don't get ticketed, reduce that gas spend as you circle or idle in the travel lane, and so on. And so never mind all of the knock-on effects in terms of benefits, in terms of safety, carbon emissions, and so forth.
And so talk to me a little bit about how these smart zones are managed or policed. Like, how do I know if I'm a driver making that delivery that I'm not going to pull up and there's a Kia Soul parked in my spot that someone just saw an open curb and randomly decided to take? Is it something that is managed and they, if someone's parking there and they shouldn't be, they're getting a ticket? Or is it just like, man, I had this space reserved and now it's out?
Yeah. So every city works a little bit differently in terms of enforcement. And so we make it our business to partner with the enforcement teams at cities very closely, and essentially try to enhance how they work versus try to completely change how they work. It's more effective. And and so one of the things that we do is provide the enforcement officers with a tool to do lookups of license plates to make sure that the vehicles that are in the smart zones have registered and paid to be there, right? So there's that sort of traditional kind of enforcement approach. We've also built in some smarts into our technology to basically reduce the risk that will happen. So, for example, we don't let you reserve the space too far in advance, because the earlier you reserve it, the more likely you are to show up late, the more likely somebody will see a free space and park there. So it's all about essentially managing, maximizing the number of vehicles that are in there at any one time who are supposed to be there. So there's less opportunities for others to come in. And then there's also buffer. So we just like airlines traditionally, schedule the flight to be a little bit longer than it usually is, so that they arrive on time more often, so to speak. We do something similar in that we work with the cities to find sufficient buffer, so that if there is a vehicle that's not supposed to be there, it doesn't necessarily shut down the whole zone. There's still sufficient space in the digital system that is bookable. So there's some buffer there, and we actually have very few issues along these lines. Like, we were worried when we started that Ubers and ride-hail vehicles would pull in and block the space. And what we have found is actually in Aspen, for example, we just published a case study about our operations there. They do use the space, but they use it very quickly. They realize that it's a space that's designated for loading. The Uber vehicles and the ride-hail vehicles know that they need to move on very quickly. And so we have not seen that cause any kind of congestion in the zone. And so the delivery vehicles that are intended users of the space have not had any significant troubles using the space from that perspective.
So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship almost. You've got people who know that, okay, I have this dedicated spot, can whip in, whip out pretty quickly. I can make more money because I'm spending less time sitting there just waiting to find a parking space. And then they're going to use it appropriately because they understand the benefit of that. That is really, really smart. So you mentioned the case study in Aspen. Where else have you guys started deploying this technology, and what are the plans for the future? Take it global, take it bigger on the market?
Yeah, so starting last year, we started to roll it out first in Omaha. Over in September, we started to roll out there. Then in West Palm Beach, and then in February. Sorry, I should mention Aspen. We started in November, and then West Palm Beach at the beginning of the year, and then Nashville we actually launched in February. And we're working with a number of cities right now that we expect to be able to announce in the coming weeks. To announce another batch, if you will, of cities that are deploying smart zones in the coming months. And so we're really excited to see the appetite, the demand for smart zones grow among cities. And I think particularly, we all know that during this pandemic, the demand for deliveries has skyrocketed, right? And so what we're seeing now, as the pandemic, at least in the U.S. and certain parts of the U.S., is starting to the outlook is starting to improve. We're seeing more passenger vehicle traffic coming back onto city streets. So you actually have more traffic, arguably, than ever, right? Because you have all these delivery vehicles, plus now all the passenger vehicle traffic coming back. And so cities are awake to that and seeing that they need to do something about this, and that there's an opportunity to kind of rethink some of this approach. And so we're seeing cities very interested in adopting smart zone like technology to manage those sort of two big trends, right? More deliveries than ever, plus all the traffic we used to have coming back, right? And so we think that's a very exciting opportunity to kind of reset some of this kind of practice, and to offer fleets a better service, reduce all those costs I talked about. And then also to reduce all the indirect costs on the city in terms of safety, emissions, and so forth.
And so you guys have kind of a threefold approach, and we've talked a little bit about the first two, the cities and the fleets, but you guys also have a focus on those on-demand, the gig workers. Talk to me a little bit about how it's more than just Uber and Lyft drivers using these smart zones. What else does it entail for those folks who maybe are making like pizza deliveries, like bike deliveries? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, so within what are called the sort of gig economy drivers, I mean, they really do two things, right? They're moving people or they're moving goods, right? And so I was referring before to the kind of the moving people part, right, where they pull in quickly, person jumps out or jumps in, and they move on. It doesn't really impede the delivery vehicle. We deliberately recommend to cities that the scope, so to speak, of a smart zone should go from everything to pizzas to CVS store replenishments, right? So goods from that pizza box up onto like all the crates that go into that pharmacy, right? So and everything in between, like the parcel delivery vehicles and so forth. So we recommend that cities think about this space in the broadest possible way for goods delivery, because that is obviously a significant use of the space. And so we have those types of meal delivery services who are also commonly called gig economy drivers too, using our space. And so that is definitely happening in smart zones that in cities where we partner. And so it's really no different of an approach. The one important difference, of course, is that they're not technically part of a fleet. They operate like a fleet, but in the sense that they are being coordinated centrally, so to speak, by the company, the network. But they're not literally a fleet. And so we cater to both. So we actually have drivers who can sign up by themselves as essentially as independent contractors for those networks, and use the core driver app as on a standalone individual basis. And then we also, that same app can also be connected to a fleet management web app that we have. So a fleet manager can log in and enroll all of their license plates for their fleet, put in payment method, credit card, ACH, that kind of thing, see their transaction history. So the kind of more traditional fleet model. And so they both work together, in short. And so we serve both types of driver, both the independent contractor as well as the the full-time employee of the fleet.
Really a true all-around approach. So last thing I want to talk about is the marriage between smart zones and smart vehicles, because we talked a lot about either autonomous or semi-autonomous delivery vehicles getting ready to roll out and kind of what the adoption of cities is going to have to do to accommodate those. How do you guys, or have y'all even thought about how to utilize those autonomous, semi-autonomous delivery vehicles and marry them into the smart zone idea?
Yeah, great question. So first off, we've actually tested this with several AV fleets, and so we definitely have already started to think about it and test how that works. Clearly, AV vehicles are much smaller in number than non-AV vehicles in the world, and so just in terms of today's market, the vast majority of the vehicles that we serve are not AV vehicles, but clearly AV is a growing trend, and there's a lot of focus on robo taxis and delivery vehicles in particular for AV. And so we see that as definitely a trend. What is also a trend is that curbs are not going anywhere, and it's valuable real estate that needs to be managed better. And pandemic notwithstanding, generally there's going to be more and more population in cities and more demand for this space if you take the macro decades view, right, which I think is probably still roughly on track even with the pandemic. And so so I think that the demand for that space is pretty fixed, and I think growing, I should say, but the space is fixed. And the other important trend to note is that by definition, an AV vehicle is, of course, in the end, a computer. Computers need data to make decisions. They are essentially replacing a human to make decision. So in short, the analog way of managing curbs simply doesn't work for a computer by definition. Like a computer needs to know where it's going. It needs to know a map of the space. It needs to be able to to request access to space. It needs to be able to pay for access to space, all on essentially a computer to computer basis, right? So there's the computer that's in the vehicle that's on the demand side for the space. Then there's the computer that is in the cloud or in some other deployed fashion along the curb that is essentially communicating with the vehicle computer to give it access. And so right now, the way I like to think about it is that humans are kind of solving a lot of the gaps here But in a world where there's not a human driving, you must have a technology like Cord to enable access to this space. It's not an option, essentially, right? So today, it I think makes the kind of the human powered world work a lot better, but it's imperative for a world in which a large number of vehicles are autonomous. And we can debate how quickly that will be, and I'm sure it will vary in different places at different times. But in the end, a computer needs to talk to a computer, and so that's kind of how I see autonomy affecting the space. I think electric charging is a trend that will be happening sooner. You already have a lot of fleets like Amazon, et cetera, UPS committing to electric fleets and buying, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on electric vehicles next year or the year after, right? So I think that charging and that kind of electrification of the infrastructure is probably something that's going to impact even sooner in the kind of the fleet world. And so we're seeing a lot of interest right now in how what we're doing connects with the charging infrastructure and how to manage access to charging as well, as people are starting to think about how to service all those vehicles that they're buying.
And we're going to be covering it every step of the way. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. This was super, super interesting. Definitely something that I had never even thought of, but you're right, so incredibly imperative, especially when we're talking about precious real estate for charging and everything in between. If people want to learn a little bit more about Cord, where should they go? Just to your website?
Yeah, cord.com, COORD.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much
Kaylee.
again.
All right. Take care.
You too. You can visit modernshipper.com to find some of these top headlines. Modern Shipper managing editor Brian Straight writes about how the economic recovery has accelerated payment provider Square's growth. In Q1, Square reported 79% year-over-year growth in their earnings on $5.06 billion in sales. That's up 266% year-over-year. Excluding their revenue from Bitcoin, Square posted a $1.5 billion net revenue. Also up on modernshipper.com is a story about how Uber and Lyft executives remained diplomatic during last week's earnings calls when reacting to decisions that would help reclassify gig workers. Last Wednesday, the Biden administration's Department of Labor withdrew a Trump-era rule that made it easier for employers to keep those gig workers classified as independent contractors versus full-time employees. The withdrawal of the rule will keep the status quo, but has many supporters of gig workers concerned that it will lead to employers forcing those gig workers to be full-time employees instead of just independent contractors. You can find all of these headlines and more every day on modernshipper.com. You can also catch At Your Doorstep every Tuesday at 2 p.m. You can always listen on podcast players of your choice.